Okay, so just for something a little bit different, I want to ask an open question, and that is, what scares you? Anyone watching this, what is the thing, the concept, the situation that scares you most? I think this is an interesting psychological question because by acknowledging our fears, um, even if we never have to confront them directly, because these are often concepts as opposed to things that have actually happened. Um, maybe maybe it can be useful in terms of preparing. The fact is, we live in a somewhat dangerous world. This is not to exaggerate, this is not to trigger anyone's anxiety, but it's just the fact. It's a dangerous world. There are all sorts of things out there that threaten us. There are natural disasters, there is terrorism, there's war, there's personal safety issues, there's bullying, there's all these unpleasant things, and there's a threat factor there. And then there's things that are nothing to do with human civilization, for example, an animal attack. Although that, I suppose you could argue that is connected in terms of people encroaching on natural habitats. But anyway, I'm rambling on. What scares you? So let me tell you what scares me. In life, I've had a few. Just a bit of background here. I've had a few hairy situations. Am I a brave person? Not as brave as some. I could hardly compare myself to a soldier or a frontline journalist or a firefighter. But done a few things that does require a bit of pluck. I mean, I've been in the boxing ring. I've confronted bullies that were, targeting vulnerable people. I've done a few things. I've spoken my opinion when I've been in a minority, which isn't an easy thing to do. So I have tested myself a few times just to be outside my comfort zone. I think that's very important. If we always look for our comfort zone in life, if we never test ourselves, if we never push the boundaries, we're always going to be in a little bubble. So I think testing ourselves to some extent is important. It reminds me of the opening lines of The Beach. I'm talking about the film version where Richard, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, says, we want to reach that great unknown, but we always want a little piece of home, a little piece of comfort. And I'd be a liar if I said I wasn't like that. I've been to the other side of the world, to a very different culture, and I wanted little reminders of the UK, not things I clung on to. I'm open minded. I experienced the other culture. I'm talking about China. And it was a great experience. But, there's always, I think most people want a little bit of comfort, whatever that might be. So anyway, I've had a few hairy situations, a few testy situations over the years. Sometimes situations that I brought on, like I challenged myself, like the boxing experience, and others which were really beyond my control. I lived for almost 2 years in a very rough housing estate, and that really had an impact on my life. Local jobs targeted my family, and it was scary at times. When you're singled out like that, and when you So looking back over my 33 years, I've had a few dicey situations, but I know that it's more than some, but it's definitely less than others. It's not comparable to a soldier or a firefighter or a frontline journalist I respect those people a lot, or human rights activists for that matter, who often have to deal with very tricky situations. Anyway, to get to the point, what scares me? What scares me? Homelessness, that scares the crap out of me, to be quite honest. The idea of rough sleeping. Here in Sunderland, like many places in the UK, we have a serious problem right now with rough sleeping, insofar as it's definitely got worse in the last 10 years. Um, I mean, Sunderland's not a very big place, it's not a huge city, and I can think of at least five different people that I know of. Some of them I've got to kind of recognise when I can, and I'm not in the most stable position myself, but when I can, I'll offer to buy them a drink or something. Sometimes I give them change, sometimes I don't. This isn't a video about the subject. It's just about anyway. I try to do the little I can, which is little, but the idea of not having a roof over your head, the idea of having nothing. It's different if you're doing it as a sort of I've just watched an old Father Ted episode where they give up stuff for Lent. That's different. That's a sacrifice that you choose to make. But when you lose everything, that's and this can also apply in countries that face natural disasters. Thinking of what's happening in southern Africa right now, people have lost everything, had little to begin with. But in the UK, we don't really face natural disasters like that. But in the south of England, there has been serious flooding, and the idea of losing your property and becoming homeless, it's something I find very difficult to because there's all sorts of problems on the streets. There's violence, there is the elements, the weather, there's where do you get your next food from. There is a whole range of questions, and not every outlet is. I mean, the YMCA, for example, only caters for people who are 25 and under. So if you're over the age of 25, the idea of being a rough sleeper or even vulnerably housed is terrifying to me. And it's so easy to fall through the gaps to just people fall on hard times. Homeless people, what people don't realize is they're as diverse as any other group of people. They come from a range of backgrounds. Some of them have been successful people, and something's went wrong in their life, and marriage has broken down. They've lost their job for whatever reason. Maybe they've been made redundant. There's a whole range of factors why people become homeless, and it terrifies me. Crime, because of my previous experience, because I lived for 2 years, like I say, I'm pretty assertive in terms of how people think, in terms of job mentality in this country. And the current knife problem we have here, that if I was a Londoner, I'd admit that would make me anxious. And I don't think you need to be bravado and I don't think it's about being bravado. I mean, you could be a tough guy, you could be physically tough, but a knife is a knife. It can be a lethal weapon. And that scares me. Just this mindless violence, this people just attacking strangers for no reason. It angers me, but it also scares me. It scares me that people could be so desensitized, so, just so prone to these outbreaks of violence. Now, I think I wouldn't say streetwise, but I'm quite worldly wise. You know, I've had situations like that, so I know what people are capable of, and it's really sad. But that's the only caveat that I'm slightly more prepared when I see certain people. There's just certain body language that people are going to be trouble, and you know to avoid it. But sometimes especially with your culture, you're not always prepared. You can be tough and brave and all the rest of it, but if someone just assaults you for no reason, it's not always a situation you can prepare for. It's not always a situation like you could just say, oh, this person's drunk or this person's you know and then get ready to defend yourself. It's not always like that. Sometimes they really do take you by surprise. So that sort of mindless violence, that sort of yob culture scares me. And in London, definitely in bigger cities, London, Birmingham, the gang culture, it's toxic. Because of my previous experience of crime, that's definitely something that gets me anxious. Not to the point where I lose sleep, but it's yeah, that's definitely up there. What else? So rough sleeping, crime. Um, being in an unhappy relationship and not being able to get out of it, like for example, being in a loveless marriage or getting into some child custody battle. So many men have been through that, and it's you hear horror stories of like falling out with the wife's in-laws or vice versa. It works both ways. You know, I don't want to sound like I'm biased here. It works both ways. You get women in difficult situations as well, and being in that situation of being in a loveless marriage where you're always arguing and it's just a toxic environment and you can't just get a divorce that easily, Or if you do get a divorce, then it gets into child custody issues. That being in that sort of situation scares me. And maybe I'm too cynical because the three girlfriends I've had a pretty good rapport with them. Obviously, I'm single now, but those relationships didn't end from some sort of heated row. They ended for practical reasons, and we ended on a pretty amicable basis. So I haven't actually had any experience to go on with that. It's just from an observational point of view. I've seen other people go through that, and it's hope I'm never in that situation. Some bitter custody battle, some bitter divorce. It's or being taken advantage of, like if you're a wealthy man and getting some gold digger. I mean, I think I'd be pretty assertive with that anyway, but it's every man's worst nightmare. Being falsely accused of rape. If I'm going to bring the gender thing into it, then yeah, as a man, being falsely accused of rape is one of the most daunting prospects in the issue of sex relations, gender relations, being falsely accused of rape, being falsely accused of anything for that matter, being falsely accused, for example, of being a paedophile, that you share somebody's name or something like that. It has happened. Um, being on the end of mob mentality must be absolutely terrifying. And that's different from a sort of ongoing anxiety. That is a instantaneous fear. Like these people can kill me if they break through. I watched Straw Dogs the other night. But there's more pertinent examples. Even the old American South, the horrible lynchings that took place there. So mob violence, and you often get it in developing countries where this might sound bad, but where education levels aren't high and people often go purely on rumors. Happens here too, but I would say to a lesser extent, it's often like mob violence is rampant in some parts of the world, and that's terrifying. And I'll close with this point. Being in trouble in another country, any other country, particularly countries with a very different culture, Western country not so much, but in a country with a very different legal system, with a corrupt legal system, where there's no jury system, or maybe more specifically, where it's an authoritarian state and they'll get you on anything. I find that very scary. Like if you're ever, for example, falsely accused of being a drug mule and you end up in some Thai jail or something, or you end up in China being accused of being a spy, something like that. It's being in trouble in a foreign country or having a misunderstanding in another country. In China, I've come across cases of foreigners getting into arguments with street vendors, and half the street turns out to look at it, and sometimes it gets out of hand. I've seen videos of this. And China's a pretty safe country for foreigners, I hasten to add. It's not a violent country, it's not dangerous, but it is still not quite. It's been open for 40 years, but and I find this in a lot of countries that don't have a pluralistic society. People are interested in foreigners, they're often welcoming, but as soon as there's any misunderstanding, that can really spiral out of control, and I find that pretty terrifying. I had it a few times in China. I never faced violence, but I did have a few slightly nerve-wracking situations where I could sense that if I didn't get out of that situation, it could have escalated. It never did, but I remember once I had to give out flyers for this new school. I was helping to promote the new school, and a crowd was really developing, and a crush was developing, and children were getting crushed. I had to tell them in Chinese, stand back. That was quite a tense situation. So mob mentality, I find very scary, far scarier than individual psychopaths. Serial killers, that sort of thing doesn't really bother me. I mean, it bothers me obviously in terms of it's awful, but it doesn't scare me personally in the way that mob mentality does. And it's strangely enough, terrorism doesn't scare me because I think the actual chance of dying from a terrorist attack is incredibly low. I'm far more scared by something like a road accident, which kills far more people. When my parents travel, when they go somewhere by car, I always get nervous. No particular reason for that, but it's just a natural instinct. So, anyway, those are some things: homelessness, crime, mob mentality, getting into some sort of trouble in another country where you don't know the Oh, and false accusations. Those are probably the five things that scare me most. Animal attacks, if I lived in a country like Australia, maybe, that would make me a little bit wary. Sydney funnel web spiders or something like that. But in Britain, we have very few dangerous animals except dangerous dogs, which are often, influenced by people anyway. So that comes into the crime issue. So, what are your fears? What scares you? What doesn't scare me is ghosts, individual killers, that sort of thing. It doesn't, somehow that doesn't get to me. Terrorism doesn't get to me. It's awful, it's sad. And in London, but the thing about terrorism, what can you do anyway? You hope that the security services take all the precautions necessary, but you can't just stop traveling. You can't let them win by stopping your life cycle. So let me know your thoughts. What scares you and why? One last point, like I said, there's some situations we bring on ourselves to challenge ourselves. If I went bungee jumping or something, which I do intend to do at some point, and I intend to get back into a boxing ring, that's a fear, but it's a very distinctive fear because it's a fear that you've brought on yourself by challenging yourself. And I've done it once. I'm proud that I've done it. It's a very strange feeling to have fear and excitement at the same time. You need to experience that. It's a very interesting feeling. And I think it does definitely strengthen personality. Let me know your thoughts.